Picture this. It's somewhere around 150,000 years ago. You are standing on the edge of an African grassland, and you are, biologically speaking, a human being. Naked, unbothered, completely unaware that one day your descendants will invent something called business casual and argue about whether genes count. At no point in this moment are you thinking about fabric. You are thinking about food, predators, and possibly a rock that looks vaguely useful. And yet here we are, tens of thousands of generations later, and almost every single human being on Earth puts something on their body before they leave the house. Not because they have to in any physical sense, because they would genuinely be arrested if they didn't. Stop and actually sit with that for a second. We built laws around nudity. We have police forces that will, under the right circumstances, get involved because a person is not wearing pants. That is an extraordinary thing for a species to organize itself around. No other animal on the planet has this problem. A lion doesn't need a permit to be a lion in public. A gorilla is never going to be escorted off a beach. But us? We looked at the human body, our own default factory setting, and collectively decided at some point that it needed a layer on top of it just to be acceptable in public. So the question is simple, even if the answer absolutely is not. Why did we start wearing clothes? When did it happen? And why did basically no other species on Earth bother? The short version is that nobody has a single clean answer. The long version involves ice ages, extinct human relatives, dyed plant fibers, a bone needle so precise it will genuinely mess with your understanding of prehistoric people, and, once again, because this story just cannot seem to avoid it, insects. We are doing this again. Stick around, because the bug part is somehow the most solid evidence in the entire story. The naked ape problem here is something that doesn't get talked about nearly enough. Humans are one of the only large mammals on Earth walking around with almost no fur. Actually stop and think about how strange that is. Every other large mammal you can name is covered. Bears, wolves, horses, elephants, chimpanzees, gorillas, all of them, across radically different climates, are wearing a built-in coat. And then there's us, patchy, pink in places. Mostly bare. The one primate that looked at millions of years of successful fur-based evolution and said, "No thanks, I'll pass." Scientists generally land on one leading explanation for this, and it comes down to temperature control. As early humans left dense forest and moved into open grassland, they started doing something almost no other primate does well, running long distances in direct heat, chasing prey until it collapsed from exhaustion. Thick fur is a serious liability in that scenario. You overheat. You slow down. You die of a heat stroke before you ever catch dinner, which is, evolutionarily, about the worst possible outcome available to you. So over an enormous stretch of time, we shed the fur and replaced it with something arguably even stranger, an absurd number of sweat glands. Somewhere between 2 and 4 million of them spread across the body. Humans are, without exaggeration, the best sweaters in the entire animal kingdom. If sweating were an Olympic event, we wouldn't just win, we'd lap the competition. Great strategy for the savannah. Considerably less great when your descendants eventually wander into Siberia in the middle of winter with nothing but bare, sweaty skin and a bad attitude. That's where clothing enters the story. Except the story is not as simple as got cold, put on a hide, problem solved. The timeline that doesn't add up here is the version most people assume is true. Early humans left Africa, walked into colder regions, felt cold, wrapped themselves in animal skins, and that was that. Clean, obvious, done. Except when you actually line up the dates, that story falls apart almost immediately. Genetic evidence puts the origin of clothing somewhere between roughly 100,000 and 170,000 years ago. But large-scale human migration out of Africa didn't really get moving until around 70,000 years ago. That's a gap of tens of thousands of years. If clothing was purely a reaction to cold weather, why does it show up so far in advance of anyone actually encountering cold weather? Something else was happening. Something that had nothing to do with the thermometer and everything to do with what was going on inside human social groups long before anyone set foot outside Africa. And the reason we even know any of this comes down to one of the strangest pieces of evidence in the history of anthropology. The bugs know human beings host two genetically distinct kinds of lice: head lice, which live in hair, and body lice, which live specifically in clothing, tucked into seams and folds of fabric. These are not the same population slowly adapting to two environments. They are two separate lineages, and at some point in history, body lice split off from head lice entirely. Here is why that detail matters so much. Body lice cannot survive on bare skin. They need fabric. They need the specific microenvironment that clothing creates: warmth, shelter, folds to hide in. Which means the moment body lice genetically branched away from head lice is essentially the moment humans started wearing clothing consistently enough to create an entirely new habitat for a parasite to move into. Researchers who ran the genetic clock on this split landed on a window of somewhere between 83,000 and 170,000 years ago. Let that land for a second. A parasite. One of the most universally despised creatures in human experience, the thing that causes outright panic in elementary school classrooms, accidentally preserved the earliest solid evidence of human clothing. Before cave paintings, before written language, before anyone thought to bury a garment with the dead, lice were already quietly documenting the fact that we'd gotten dressed. They were there for it. They adapted to it in real time. That is either one of the most elegant pieces of scientific detective work you'll ever hear, or deeply unsettling. Honestly, it's probably both. So, what were clothes actually for first? If clothing predates the migration into cold climates by tens of thousands of years, then warmth cannot be the original reason we started wearing it. So what was? Theory 1. Basic physical protection. Not from cold, but from everything else the environment throws at bare skin. Thorns, insect bites, sunburn, scraped elbows from crawling through brush while tracking an animal for 6 hours. A simple wrap made from hide creates a barrier between your body and 100 small daily injuries that, left untreated, can turn into infections. It's not romantic. It's not culturally interesting. But it is extremely practical, and sometimes the boring explanation really is the correct one. Theory 2, and this is where things get genuinely fascinating: social signaling. Humans are relentlessly, almost obsessively social creatures. We track status, hierarchy, group identity, and reputation constantly, often without even realizing we're doing it. We do this with posture, with tone of voice, with hairstyles, with scars worn as badges and tattoos worn as declarations. And there is strong evidence that we were doing exactly this with our bodies long before we started doing it with clothing. Traces of ochre, a natural pigment, show up in the archaeological record as far back as 200,000 years ago, used for body decoration. That predates even the earliest lice evidence for clothing. In other words, we were painting ourselves before we were dressing ourselves. And the leap from decorating bare skin to draping a particular hide over your shoulders in a particular way is not a large cognitive jump at all. Once you're wearing something, you start noticing what it says. Whose hide is this? Did I kill it myself? What does wearing this animal's skin communicate to the people around the fire tonight? Congratulations! You've just witnessed the birth of the world's first fashion argument, staged around a fire on the African savannah, over who gets to wear the good pelt. The needle that changed everything for a very long stretch of human history, clothing was simple. A hide thrown over the shoulders, held on with a cord of twisted sinew. Roughly cut, roughly worn, more sack than garment. It worked. Nobody was impressed by it. Then, around 50,000 years ago, something shifts in the archaeological record. Researchers start finding bone needles, not crude awls for punching holes, but genuine needles with tiny drilled eyes, clearly designed for threading fiber and stitching material together with real precision. The oldest confirmed eyed needle was found in Denisova Cave in Siberia, dated to roughly 50,000 years old, carved from the hollow bone of a bird and polished to a fineness that is, frankly, hard to believe when you see it. Someone looked at a sliver of bone and imagined a tool that did not yet exist. Someone figured out how to drill a clean hole through the narrow end without shattering it. Someone used that finished tool to join two pieces of hide with a controlled, repeatable stitch. That is not instinct. That is engineering. That is a person solving a problem through imagination and patience rather than brute force, tens of thousands of years before anyone wrote anything down. And that needle matters more than almost anything else from this period, because you can survive without pottery. You can survive without cave art. In the middle of a Siberian winter, 50,000 years ago, without fitted clothing that actually seals warm air against your skin, you cannot survive at all. We weren't the only ones getting dressed here's a part of the story that tends to get quietly dropped, mostly because it complicates the modern humans invented everything narrative that people like to tell. Neanderthals were also making and wearing clothing, and they were doing it long before they ever crossed paths with us. There's clear archaeological evidence of Neanderthals systematically processing animal hides, using stone tools specifically shaped for scraping and preparing leather, and butchering carcasses in ways that suggest they cared as much about the skin as the meat. Their bodies also carried physical adaptations built for serious cold, stockier builds, shorter limbs, different fat distribution. That's not a species that occasionally felt a chill. That's a species that had been dealing with real cold for a very long time. And clothing wasn't optional for them either. Then there are the Denisovans, a mysterious third human lineage that we only confirmed existed in 2010, identified from a single finger bone found in that exact same Siberian cave as the needle. In the same layers of sediment, researchers found pierced and polished ornaments, evidence of deliberate decoration, possibly even garment embellishment. A group of people we barely know anything about were already thinking carefully about how they looked. So the impulse to cover, decorate, and shape the body wasn't unique to us. Multiple separate human species in different environments arrived at strikingly similar solutions, which raises a genuinely strange question. Is clothing a human thing? Or is it just what happens when you take any sufficiently intelligent, social, cold-adjacent primate and give it enough time? We don't have a clean answer. But the fact that it happened more than once, independently, is very hard to write off as coincidence. Clothing as language here's the part that separates humans from literally every other species on Earth in this story. If clothing were purely practical, every culture in every climate would eventually converge on the single most efficient thermal solution and just stay there. Heavy hides in cold regions, light fibers in hot ones, done, end of story, no further innovation required. That is not remotely what happened. Instead, humans immediately, almost universally, loaded clothing with meaning that had nothing to do with survival. Priests dressed differently than warriors. Rulers wore materials and colors that ordinary people were legally forbidden from touching. The dead were buried in specific garments chosen for the journey ahead of them, not the weather outside. Ceremonies demanded specific dress that would look absurd in any other setting. Some of the oldest surviving textile fragments in the archaeological record weren't just woven for warmth. They were dyed, in multiple colors, with techniques that took real effort to develop. Someone, tens of thousands of years ago, looked at a piece of fabric that was already doing its job perfectly well and decided it needed to be a different color. Not for warmth, for meaning. This is the strange, uniquely human thing about clothing. We turned it into a language. A way to say, I belong to this group, I hold this rank, I am mourning, I am celebrating, I am dangerous, I am sacred, I am ordinary, all without saying a single word out loud. Peacocks display. Cuttlefish shift color, but none of them are choosing what to communicate based on shifting social context and personal history. That part is entirely, unmistakably ours. When clothing became survival, even if warmth wasn't the original reason we started dressing, it became a matter of life and death fast. Somewhere between roughly 120,000 and 70,000 years ago, the planet went through a series of brutal glacial cycles. Temperatures dropped hard, ice sheets expanded, large parts of Africa turned hyper-arid, lakes dried up, and food sources collapsed. By some estimates, the entire human population may have crashed to somewhere between 10 and 30,000 individuals at its lowest point. We came terrifyingly close to simply not making it. As a species. Before we'd even really gotten started. For the groups that survived, and especially for those who later pushed into colder territory across Europe and Central Asia, clothing stopped being a social statement and became the difference between living and freezing to death. A properly constructed garment traps warm air against the skin. It seals off the wrists and neck. Exactly where blood runs closest to the surface and heat escapes fastest. It's the difference between surviving a night at freezing temperatures and not surviving it at all. The groups who already had the needle, the thread, the technique, they made it through. They had children. Those children learned the same skills and passed them forward. And that inherited knowledge is a genuinely significant part of how humans eventually spread across every continent on Earth, including some of the coldest, most hostile places on the planet. We didn't just adapt our bodies to survive the world. We built a second skin and carried it with us everywhere we went. From hides to threads, there's one more transition worth mentioning, mostly because it rarely gets its due credit. The shift from animal hides to woven plant fiber. Hides are warm, tough, water-resistant. They're also heavy, stiff, hard to maintain, and require killing an animal to get one, which is a significant logistical limitation if you need clothing at scale. At some point, humans began working plant fibers instead, twisting them into cord, spinning them into thread, eventually weaving them into actual fabric. The oldest known twisted plant fiber was discovered in a cave in the country of Georgia and dates back roughly 30,000 years. And notably, those fibers were already dyed in multiple colors. Decorative, intentional, communicating something well beyond basic warmth, right from the very beginning of the technology. By the time of the agricultural revolution, roughly 10,000 BC onward, textile production had become one of the central technologies of human civilization. Flax for linen. Wool from domesticated sheep. Later, cotton and silk, each developed independently by different cultures around the world. And with textile production came something genuinely new. The wardrobe. Clothing specialized for purpose. A heavy layer for winter, a light wrap for summer, specific garments reserved for ritual, for labor, for mourning, for status. Clothing stopped being a single object built for survival and became an entire system built for expression. None of this happened by accident, and none of it was cheap. Entire trade routes formed around the movement of textiles. Empires financed themselves on the back of fabric. Wars were fought over access to raw materials. Silk alone reshaped the political map of half the ancient world. All of it traces back to a cold, mostly hairless primate with clever hands and a sliver of sharpened bone. So why did we actually start wearing clothes? The honest answer is, for all of these reasons, layered on top of each other, unfolding across tens of thousands of years. It probably started as basic protection. A barrier between skin and thorns and sun and insects. It became social signaling almost immediately after that, a way of saying something about yourself in a world full of other people constantly reading you. It turned into a survival technology when the climate turned hostile and the migrations began. And eventually it became an art form, an economy, and a language of its own, as human culture grew more complicated than any single garment could ever be. The remarkable thing isn't really that we started wearing clothes. Given who we are, deeply social, obsessed with status, chronically cold half the time, it was probably always going to happen eventually. You did this exact thing today. Whatever you're wearing right now, you made choices about it. Some conscious, some automatic. And those choices say something about how you feel, what group you belong to, and what version of yourself you're presenting to the world before you've said a single word. You are doing precisely what someone was doing on the African savanna 150,000 years ago, wrapped in an ochre-stained hide, quietly figuring out how to say something about themselves to the people gathered around the same fire. That's not a small connection across time. That might genuinely be the whole story. We get cold, we get creative, we get dressed. And then, somehow, every single one of us still ends up standing in front of a closet full of clothes, insisting we have nothing to wear. Some things really never change. So here's the question for you. If you had to go back and live in that world, no clothes, no needles, no fabric, just skin and fire, would you actually make it? Let me know down in the comments. See you in the next one.